There was an old woman who had no family still living. Her only friend was a little white dog who went everywhere with her with one exception. The dog loved the fireplace in winter, and after the old woman went to bed, he would sometimes go and lie in front of the warm coals. Usually, though, the dog slept at the very edge of the bed on a throw rug. The woman would allow the dog on the bed with her, but if she became frightened or had a nightmare, she would put her hand down to the little white dog, and he would lick it reassuringly. One night, the woman was reading her newspaper just before going to sleep. She shivered and pulled the comforter up around her as she read that a mental patient had wandered off from a nearby hospital. No one knew if the patient was dangerous or not. He was a suspect in the murders of several women who had lived alone. The woman turned out the lights and tried to sleep, but she was frightened and tossed and turned fitfully. Finally, she reached down to where the little white dog slept. Sure enough, a warm, wet tongue began to lick her hand. The woman felt reassured and safe, and left her hand dangling off the bed as she turned and settled in comfortably. She opened her eyes for a moment and looked through the open door into the living room. There in front of the fireplace sat her little white dog, gazing at the coals and wagging his tail. And down beside her bed, something was still licking her hand. Richard was living in a not-so-nice neighborhood with his parents. Their house was badly in need of repair, and none of the windows or doors ever locked properly. Richard complained to his mom about not being able to sleep because of these scratching noises in his room. His mom assumed that it was rats, or that some cat had managed to get in the house again and was in the room somewhere. After turning on the lights and not seeing any sort of animal, she told Richard to go back to bed. So Richard went back to bed and was awakened almost immediately again by the scratching, insistent, ceaseless. He still couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but this time he decided to ignore it, so he fell asleep again. Richard had no idea how long he'd been asleep when he suddenly sat up in bed, crying out, his hands flying to his back. He'd been bitten in the middle of his back while he slept, yet he'd been lying on his back. Richard decided that things were just too weird and went to get his dad. His dad looked at his back. The spot that hurt certainly didn't look like a bite. It looked more like a puncture wound. So he flipped on the bedroom light and inspected Richard's bed. There was a hole in the fitted sheet, and so the mattress stuffing was showing through the hole. At a loss to explain how it happened, Richard suggested that maybe a spring had come through, so Richard's dad flipped the twin bed over to see if the box springs were the culprit. What he found was a long knife stuck in the mattress, pointing upwards towards where a person might lie. He also found mud and dirt under the bed, the exact length of a person. Checking immediately outside the window, he found fresh footprints in the mud, leading to and then away from the window. Someone had slipped into Richard's room through the unlocked window and lain under his bed. The scratching sound he heard was the person using the knife to dig through the box springs and mattress to kill them. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning and I was in my house alone. I was getting ready for bed and was beginning to say my prayers. I have a special prayer room where I go and say my prayers. Something told me to go into my room and begin to say my prayers now. Down on my prayer rug and started saying my prayers. While saying my prayers, I began to hear this thumping noise. It sounded very far away. I wondered to myself what it was because there was no one else in the house but me. The thumping started to get louder and closer. I listened again and wondered what it was. Suddenly I began to smell this smell. It was faint at first, but became stronger as the thumping became louder. This smell smelled like despair, hopelessness, unhappiness, being lost, extreme sadness, emptiness. It grew stronger and the thumping louder. I continued with my praying, wondering who or what was coming my way. for it was obvious it was coming to me. The thumping became like drums, banging one step at a time. Louder and louder it came, the smell overwhelming high. I continued praying. The sound suddenly stopped. I was totally petrified, out of the corner of my eyes, for I was looking straight ahead, saying my prayers fervently. I saw this thing standing in the entrance of my prayer room. It was 8 to 9 feet tall. It was so black that the darkness silhouetted around it. I had no lights on in the other part of the house. It had a face like a bull, and it slowly turned its red eyes towards me and looked down on me where I was sitting saying my prayers. The feelings of despair, hopelessness, unhappiness, swaying and churning inside of it, screaming, crying out from its being. This thing looked straight at me for a full 30 seconds, not saying a word, just looking, watching, not coming into the room. I continued saying my prayers. Suddenly it vanished, disappeared without a trace. I finished my prayers and went to bed. True story, no lie. My experience from this made me realize that all the misery and misfortunes that mankind is experiencing and trying to correct stems from this one creature, who creates and consumes people manifesting these types of energies. Until we realize this is the real villain, trying to correct those ills mentioned, it is useless.